today, we are shifting our focus. We've covered the horrors of the trenches and the mysteries of the ice. But today's story is different. It is arguably the most famous survival story of the 20th century, yet few people know the true, day-by-day, psychological toll of what actually happened on that glacier. We are building a global community here of people who appreciate dark, atmospheric storytelling. I am always fascinated to see where you are all listening from, whether you're working the night shift, studying, or just relaxing in the dark. So, before we descend into the Andes, do me a favor, scroll down and leave a comment. Let me know what city or country you are watching from right now. I read every single one. As always, if you appreciate these long-form deep dives, please leave a like on the video. It helps the signal cut through the noise. Now, put on your headphones, turn off the lights. Let's go to 1972. The Andes Mountains are not designed for human life. At 12,000 feet, the atmosphere becomes a hostile entity. The air is so thin that the lungs must work twice as hard simply to keep the heart beating. The solar radiation, unfiltered by the lower atmosphere, is intense enough to burn the corneas within hours. The temperature at night plunges to 30 degrees below zero, a cold so absolute that it does not just freeze water, it freezes the blood in the veins. There is no vegetation, there is no animal life, there is only rock and ice, and a silence that has remained unbroken for 10,000 years. It is a place of absolute geological indifference. The mountains do not care if you are wealthy. They do not care if you are strong. They do not care if you are good. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1972, a white metal tube containing 45 souls was smashed against this indifference. They were not Arctic explorers equipped for the pole. They were not soldiers trained for survival. They were schoolboys, a rugby team from Montevideo, dressed in summer blazers and loafers, flying toward a weekend of parties and matches in Chile. They had no food. They had no winter clothing. They had no medical supplies. By all laws of probability and biology, they were supposed to die on impact. Those who survived the crash were supposed to freeze to death on the first night. Those who survived the freeze were supposed to die of thirst within a week. They did not die. For 72 days, they endured the impossible. They built a society from the wreckage of their own lives. They slept on human remains, to insulate themselves from the ice. But to buy their lives, to cheat the mountain of its prize, they had to do the unthinkable. They had to break the oldest, most sacred taboo of the human species. To live, they had to consume the dead. This is the story of Flight 571. Chapter 1. The Lead. Sled. To understand the horror of the mountain, one must first understand the warmth of the valley they left behind. The boys of the Old Christians Club were the golden generation of Montevideo, Uruguay. In 1972, Uruguay was a country in turmoil, plagued by economic stagnation and political violence. But the boys on the plain lived in a different world. They were the sons of doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. They had grown up in the wealthy suburb of Carrasco, a bubble of order and comfort. They attended the Stella Maris College, a private Catholic school run by the Christian Brothers of Ireland. Their education was rigorous, but their true religion was rugby. Rugby was more than a game to them. It was an ethical framework. It taught them discipline. It taught them that pain was temporary, but the team was eternal. It taught them that the individual is nothing without the pack. They didn't know it yet, but the scrums and the tackles on the muddy fields of Montevideo were the only training they would have for the nightmare waiting in the clouds. The trip to Santiago, Chile was an annual tradition. It was meant to be a celebration, a weekend of rugby matches against Chilean teams, followed by nights of parties and girls. Because the cost of chartering a military plane was high, the team could not fill all 45 seats on their own. To lower the price per person, they opened the flight to friends, family, and supporters. Graciela Mariani bought a ticket to attend her daughter's wedding in Chile. Eugenia Parado packed her bags to accompany her son, Nando. She brought her 19-year-old daughter, Susie, along for the adventure. Javier Methol, a cousin of one of the players, brought his wife Liliana for a romantic getaway to celebrate their anniversary. They packed for a vacation. They filled their suitcases with short-sleeved shirts, light sports jackets, beachwear, and gifts. Some of the boys spent their last remaining pesos on chocolates and wine to share at the parties in Santiago. Not a single person on board packed a heavy coat. The machine that would carry them across the spine of the continent was a Fairchild Hiller FH-227D, tail number 571, belonging to the Uruguayan Air Force. To the untrained eye, it was a sturdy modern twin-engine turboprop. But among the pilots who flew the treacherous routes of the southern cone, the FH-227D had a darker reputation. It was a stretched version of a Dutch aircraft, the Fokker F-27. The Americans had lengthened the fuselage to fit more passengers, but had not significantly upgraded the engines to handle the extra weight. As a result, the plane was notoriously underpowered. It struggled to gain altitude quickly. It handled sluggishly when fully loaded. The pilots of the Uruguayan Air Force had a nickname for it, the lead sled. Commanding the flight was Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, a veteran with over 5,000 hours of flight time. He had flown across the Andes 29 times. In the co-pilot's seat was Lieutenant Dante Lagurara, a younger man who was training under Ferradas's supervision. The flight's plan was simple, but the Andes made nothing simple. The mountains between Argentina and Chile are some of the highest in the world, with peaks reaching over 22,000 feet. The Fairchild, fully loaded with 45 people and luggage, had a maximum ceiling of roughly 28,000 feet, but to push the lead sled that high was dangerous and fuel-intensive. Instead of flying straight over the highest peaks, the standard procedure for lower-flying prop planes was to fly south from Mendoza, parallel to the mountains, until they reached the Planchon Pass. This was a natural dip in the mountain range, a corridor where the peaks were lower. The pilot would fly south to the pass, turn west to cross the border into Chile, and then turn north towards Santiago. It was a U-shaped route, adding time to the journey but ensuring safety. The flight had already been delayed. They had left Montevideo on Thursday, October 12th, but severe weather over the Andes forced them to land in Mendoza, Argentina, on the foothills of the mountain range. They spent the night in the small provincial town, the boys growing impatient, agitated, and eager to get to the parties in Santiago. The next morning, Friday the 13th, the weather report was ambiguous. The pass was still clouded over, but there was a window. Colonel Ferradas, perhaps feeling the pressure of 40 young men eager to leave, made the decision to fly. At 2:18 p.m., Flight 571 took off from Mendoza. It climbed into the grey sky, turning south toward the Planchon Pass. Inside the cabin, the mood was electric. The boys were playing cards, tossing a rugby ball down the aisle, and joking about the turbulence. When the plane dropped suddenly in an air pocket, they cheered as if they were on a roller coaster. They were immortal. They were young. The concept of death was abstract, something that happened to old people in hospital beds, not to rugby players on a Friday afternoon. In the cockpit, however, a fatal chain of events was beginning to unfold. The Fairchild was flying into a massive cloud bank. Visibility was zero. The pilots were flying solely by dead reckoning, calculating their position based on speed, time, and direction. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They were flying into a severe headwind that was slowing the plane's ground speed significantly. The instruments told them they were moving at a certain speed, but in reality, the wind was holding them back. At 3:21 p.m., Lieutenant Lagurara radioed air traffic control in Santiago. He reported that they were over the Planchon Pass and were turning west. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. Based on his calculations, he believed he had already crossed the spine of the Andes and was now over the foothills of Chile. In reality, the headwind had slowed the plane so much that they were still deep in the middle of the mountains. When Lagurara turned the control yoke to the west, he thought he was beginning his descent toward the green valleys of Chile. Instead, he was steering the lead sled directly into the heart of the most jagged peaks in the hemisphere. He began to descend. He requested permission to drop to 10,000 feet. The controller in Santiago, seeing no reason to doubt the pilot's position report, granted permission. The plane dipped its nose and flew downward through the blinding white clouds. Inside the cabin, the mood shifted. The turbulence became violent. The plane shook and rattled, the metal groaning under the stress. The cheering stopped. Passengers looked out the windows, but saw only a milky white void. And then, for a split second, the clouds parted. It was not the green valley of Chile they saw. It was black rock. They were not thousands of feet above the ground. They were mere yards away from a vertical wall of stone. The plane's collision warning alarm began to scream. La Guerrera pulled back on the yoke with all his strength, trying to force the heavy, underpowered plane to climb. The engines roared, straining to lift the nose. The plane shuddered, fighting gravity, fighting the wind, fighting the inevitable. For a heartbeat, it seemed they might make it. The nose cleared the ridge, but the tail did not. At 3:34 p.m., the right wing clipped the mountain. The impact was catastrophic. The wing was sheared off instantly, folding back and slicing off the tail section of the plane like a guillotine. In that split second, the rear of the fuselage opened up to the sky. 5 people, still strapped into their seats, were sucked out into the void. The steward, the navigator, and 3 of the boys vanished into the white abyss before they could even scream. Moments later, the left wing struck another peak and tore away. Now, the plane was no longer an aircraft. It was a wingless, tailless metal projectile, a 45-foot bullet screaming through the air. It hit the steep, snow-covered slope of a glacier at 200 miles per hour. Crucially, it did not explode. The angle of impact matched the slope of the mountain perfectly. Instead of smashing into the rock, the fuselage landed on its belly and became a toboggan. It slid down the glacier, careening wildly over the ice for nearly 2,000 feet. Inside, the seats were ripped from their bolts. The boys were thrown forward, crushed against one another in a tangled mass of metal, fiberglass, and human limbs. The G-force was immense, snapping spines and shattering legs. The slide seemed to last forever, a chaotic blur of noise and snow, until the fuselage slammed into a massive snowbank and came to a violent, shuddering halt. The nose gear collapsed, forcing the cockpit upward and crushing the pilots against the instrument panel. Then there was silence. The fuselage sat at an angle on the glacier, surrounded on 3 sides by towering amphitheaters of rock. They were at 11,800 feet. They were in the middle of the Andes, in a place that did not appear on any map. The silence of the mountains returned, heavier than before, but inside the broken tube, the screaming was just beginning. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the metallic scent of blood. The cold air rushed in through the gaping hole where the tail used to be, instantly dropping the temperature inside the cabin to match the frozen hell outside. The lead sled had stopped. The journey of the old Christians was over. The 72 days had begun. Chapter 2. The Guillotine. The silence that followed the crash was heavier than the noise that preceded it. For minutes, the only sound in the white void was the settling of the snow and the hissing of steam from the shattered engines. The violence of the impact had been absolute, a chaotic blur of physics that stripped away civilization and left only biology. When the fuselage finally shuddered to a halt in the snowbank, the interior of the plane was a landscape of ruin. The seats, designed to hold passengers in place during minor turbulence, had failed catastrophically under the immense G-forces of the deceleration. They had torn loose from their floorbolts and hurtled forward, stacking up like falling dominoes or the bellows of an accordion. The passengers trapped in those seats were crushed against the rows in front of them, creating a tangled, claustrophobic mass of steel, cushion, and human limbs. The air inside the cabin was thick with a choking dust, kicked up from the insulation and debris. But cutting through the dust was a smell that terrified the survivors more than the blood, the sharp chemical sting of aviation fuel. The fuel tanks in the wings had ruptured during the slide, and the wreckage was now soaked in kerosene. To the dazed survivors pulling themselves from the pile, the fear was immediate: fire. If a spark ignited the fumes, the metal tube would become an incinerator. They were trapped in a potential bomb. Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student with a stubborn, pragmatic mind, was one of the first to emerge from the wreckage unscathed. He had been thrown forward, but miraculously avoided serious injury. He shook off the shock and immediately went into a mode that would define his role for the next 2.5 months. He became the doctor. Beside him was Gustavo Zerbino, another first-year medical student. Neither of them had finished their training. They had never treated a catastrophic trauma patient. They had no bandages, no morphine, no antiseptics. All they had were their hands and the wreckage of the plane. They began to crawl over the mountain of broken seats, pulling people from the debris. The injuries were horrific. The force of the seats collapsing had snapped shins and femurs like dry twigs. There were compound fractures where bone protruded through denim and wool. There were severe head traumas. Some of the boys were screaming in agony. Others were silent, wandering in a dazed stupor, their minds unable to process the reality of their situation. Canessa and Zerbino had to make instantaneous, brutal decisions. They performed a battlefield triage in the freezing dusk. They checked pulses. If a boy was screaming, he was alive. If he was silent and buried under the metal, he was likely gone. They found Nando Parado, one of the team's most athletic players, lying unconscious near the front of the cabin. His head was swollen, his skull fractured. Canessa checked for a pulse and found it faint. Believing Nando was hours away from death, they moved on to those they thought they could save. They placed Nando in the cold, ironically saving his life by reducing the swelling in his brain. At the front of the fuselage, the cockpit had been destroyed. The nose gear had collapsed upward upon impact, crushing the pilots against the instrument panel. Colonel Ferradas, the pilot in command, was dead, his chest crushed by the yoke, but the co-pilot, Lieutenant Dante Lagurara, was still alive. He was pinned in his seat, the instrument panel compressing his chest and legs. He was in agony, drifting in and out of delirium. When the survivors reached him, Lagurara was mumbling, confused, trapped in the delusion of his own error. He kept repeating, "We passed Curico. We passed Curico." He was convinced they had successfully crossed the Andes and had crashed in the foothills of Chile. He begged the boys to find his revolver. He wanted them to use it on him. The pain was too great. The boys tried to free him, pulling at the twisted metal, but he was fused to the machine. They could not move the instrument panel. They could not find the gun. They could only offer him snow to eat and listen to his pleas as the light began to fade. As the adrenaline of the crash began to wear off, a new, more insidious enemy revealed itself. The sun dipped behind the towering peaks to the west, and the temperature began to plummet. In the Andes, the difference between sunlight and shadow is the difference between life and death. The air temperature dropped rapidly, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees below zero. The fuselage, which had been their vessel, was now a broken shell. The tail section was gone, leaving a gaping hole at the rear of the cabin roughly 10 feet wide. The cold air rushed in like a physical force, a wall of wind that cut through their thin summer clothes. They were wearing blazers, loafers, and short-sleeved shirts. They had expected the 60-degree spring weather of Santiago. Now, they were standing in one of the coldest places on Earth. Marcelo Perez, the captain of the rugby team, took charge. He was a natural leader, charismatic and organized. He realized that if they did not seal the breach in the fuselage, they would all freeze to death before morning. He organized the uninjured boys to build a wall. They dragged suitcases, broken seats, and torn fragments of the cabin to the open rear of the plane. They stacked them, high, weaving them together to create a makeshift barricade against the wind and the snow. It was imperfect. Gaps remained where the wind whistled through, but it turned the fuselage into a cave rather than a tunnel. Night fell. It was the first night of the 72 days, and for many of the survivors, it was the worst night of their lives. They had no light. Inside the fuselage, it was pitch black. 32 survivors were crammed into a space roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, the only area clear of the mangled seats. They huddled together in a chaotic pile, fighting for the center, fighting for body warmth. The darkness amplified the horror. They could not see the injuries, but they could smell the blood and feel the cold stiffening the bodies of the dead who still lay among them. The sounds of the night were unbearable. The wind howled outside, a constant mournful shriek that reminded them of their isolation. Inside, the moans of the injured filled the small space. Boys cried, out for their mothers. They cried out for water. They cried out in pain from their broken legs. Every time someone moved in the darkness to relieve a cramped muscle, they inevitably kicked or bumped a broken limb, eliciting screams of agony from the wounded. Tempers flared. Panic set in. Some of the younger boys began to hyperventilate. Marcelo Perez and the other older boys shouted into the darkness, trying to maintain order, trying to keep the group from descending into total hysteria. "Be quiet," they yelled. "Save your energy." But the cold was relentless. It was not just a temperature, it was a presence. It gnawed at their extremities. To stay warm, they began to punch each other's arms and legs, trying to keep the circulation moving. They rubbed each other's backs. They urinated on their own hands just to feel a moment of warmth, only to have the liquid freeze on their skin seconds later. In the cockpit, the moans of Lieutenant Lagurara grew softer. He spent the night, trapped in the wreckage, slowly freezing to death, still believing they were in Curicó. By morning, his voice was silenced. He became another statistic of the crash, taking the secret of their true location to his grave. As the hours dragged on, the survivors began to realize that some of those huddling with them were no longer moving. The woman, Graziella Mariani, who had been trapped under the seats, passed away in the darkness. Several of the younger players, whose internal injuries were too severe, drifted into silence and then into death. The survivors were literally sleeping with corpses, unable to distinguish the cold skin of the dead from the freezing skin of the living. When the sun finally rose on Saturday, October 14th, it did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The light revealed the carnage they had felt in the dark. The interior of the plane was a slaughterhouse. Blood was frozen in red stalactites on the metal walls. Brain matter and viscera were smeared on the upholstery. They stepped out of the fuselage into the blinding white light of the morning. For the first time, they could truly see where they were. They looked around, desperate for a sign of the green valley La Gurara had promised. They looked for trees. They looked for a farmhouse. They looked for a road. They saw nothing but white. They were in a bowl of ice, surrounded on three sides by sheer vertical walls of rock and snow that rose thousands of feet above them. To the east, the glacier stretched down into an abyss. They were nowhere. They were tiny, insignificant specks on a vast sheet of ice, suspended between the sky and the jagged teeth of the Andes. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were not in the foothills. They were deep in the heart of the Cordillera. They checked the watches of the dead. It was morning. The search planes would be coming. They had to be coming. They scanned the sky, their eyes burning from the glare of the snow, waiting for the metallic glint of rescue. But the sky remained a terrifying empty blue. Inside the wreckage, Nando Parado opened his eyes. He had survived the coma. He looked around, confused, his head throbbing with a pain that would not leave him for months. He saw his friend, Roberto Canessa, looking at him with the expression of a man who had seen a ghost. Nando did not know yet that his mother was dead. He did not know that his sister was dying in the rear of the plane. He only knew that he was thirsty. "Water," he whispered, and with that single word, the second struggle began. They had survived the crash. They had survived the freeze. Now, they had to survive the thirst. Chapter 3. The Hospital of Hell. The sun on the glacier was a deception. It rose with a blinding diamond-hard brilliance that promised warmth, but it delivered only radiation. The ultraviolet rays, unfiltered by the thin atmosphere at 12,000 feet, did not thaw the air. They cooked the skin. Within hours of stepping out of the fuselage, the survivors' faces began to blister. Their lips cracked and bled. Their eyes, unprotected by sunglasses, began to burn with the gritty sandpaper sensation of snow blindness. But inside the fuselage, the sun could not reach. The wreckage of the Fairchild had transformed from a vehicle into a crypt, and now into a purgatory. It was here, in the dim, blood-stained twilight of the cabin, that the new social order began to take shape. It was not a hierarchy based on wealth or popularity or rugby skills. It was a hierarchy of the intact versus the broken. There were 29 survivors still alive on the second day, but alive was a relative term. Some were walking wounded, sporting bruises and cuts. Others were shattered, their bodies broken in ways that defied the comprehension of the 19-year-old boys looking down at them. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zabino were the closest things the group had to doctors. Both were first-year medical, students at the University of the Republic in Montevideo. They had taken classes on anatomy, they had dissected cadavers, they had memorized the names of bones and muscles, but they had never treated a living patient. They had never set a bone. They had never stitched a wound. They were children playing at being surgeons, standing in a slaughterhouse with empty hands. The hospital was the front section of the fuselage, a space roughly 6 feet wide and 10 feet long, where the seats had been ripped away. Here, on the freezing, debris-strewn floor, the most critically injured lay in a tangle of limbs and groans. The air was heavy with the metallic copper scent of fresh blood and the sickening sweet smell of aviation fuel that had soaked into the carpets. Canessa and Zabino went to work with a manic, desperate energy. Their first task was assessment. They crawled over the bodies, checking pulses, lifting eyelids, and palpating abdomens. What they found was a catalogue of trauma that would have overwhelmed a fully equipped trauma center. Rafael Echevarren, a gentle, quiet boy, had his right calf muscle almost completely torn away. The muscle hung loose, exposing the tibia. He was in shock, shivering uncontrollably, but he didn't scream. He simply asked for water. Enrique Platero had a piece of metal tubing impaled in his abdomen. When Canessa approached him, Platero looked down at his own stomach, saw the intestine protruding, and looked back at Canessa with a terrifying calmness. "I think I have something inside me," he said. Canessa, suppressing the urge to vomit, pulled the tube out and pushed the intestine back inside, securing it with a makeshift bandage. Platero stood up and immediately went to help clear debris. The shock had numbed him to the horror of his own body. The medical students quickly realized the limitation of their resources. They had no antiseptic to clean the wounds. They had no morphine to dull the pain. They had no plaster to cast. The broken bones. They had to improvise, and the wreckage became their pharmacy. They found a bottle of cologne in someone's luggage. It was high in alcohol content. They used it to disinfect wounds, pouring the stinging liquid directly onto open tears in the flesh. The screaming that followed was terrible, but it was necessary. For bandages, they turned to the seats. The seat covers were made of a white synthetic cloth. They ripped them off the cushions and tore them into strips. But the cloth was not sterile. It was dirty, covered in dust and the sweat of the flight. It would have to do. For splints, they scavenged the plane's interior paneling and the slats from the luggage racks. They snapped the wood into lengths, placed them against the shattered legs of their friends, and bound them tight with the seat cover bandages. The most difficult problem was the floor. The metal floor of the fuselage was freezing. To lie on it was to invite hypothermia. Furthermore, the floor was wet with melted snow and bodily fluids. For the boys with compound fractures in their legs, lying on the floor meant their open wounds were constantly soaking in a bacteria-rich sludge. Gangrene was a ticking clock. Canessa and Zabino devised a solution that was both brilliant and medieval. They looked up at the ceiling of the fuselage. The luggage racks had nylon nets designed to hold suitcases in place. They cut these nets down. Using the metal poles of the cabin structure, they fashioned hammocks. They suspended the boys with the worst leg breaks, Arturo Noguera and Rafael Echevarren, in these hammocks, swinging a few feet above the wet floor. It was agonizing for the patients to be moved into them, their broken bones grinding together with every shift of weight. But once suspended, they were dry. They were the privileged patients of the hospital of hell, floating above the misery of the floor. While the doctors worked on the bodies, a different kind of healing was happening in the mind of Nando Parrado. Nando had spent the first 3 days in a coma, placed near the jagged opening of the fuselage where the cold was most intense. The group had assumed he was dead or dying, but the cold had reduced the swelling in his brain. On the 3rd day, he opened his eyes. He woke into a nightmare. His head throbbed with a skull fracture. He was weak, confused, and surrounded by the groans of the dying. He looked around for his family. He saw his friend, Panchito Abel, lying nearby. Panchito, the handsome, charming playboy of the team, was delirious, his brain hemorrhaging. Nando held his hand, whispering to him, but Panchito did not recognize him. He died hours later, slipping away in the cold. Then Nando asked for his mother and sister. The silence from the group told him everything. His mother, Eugenia, had died on impact. Her body was lying outside in the snow, preserved in the frozen chapel of the Andes. But his sister Susie was alive. She was lying in the rear of the cabin, barely conscious. Nando crawled to her. She was battered, her face bruised, her breathing shallow. She could not speak, only whimper. For Nando, the universe narrowed down to a single point, Susie. He lay beside her, warming her with his body, melting snow in his mouth to drip water between her cracked lips. He ignored his own pain, his own hunger. He became her guardian. He told her they would go home. He told her about the kitchen in their house in Carrasco. He fed her hallucinations of safety, but the hospital had no medicine for the internal trauma Susie had suffered. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her life force fading with the setting sun each day. Nando watched her helplessly, the frustration boiling inside him. This was the cruelty of the crash. It did not kill everyone instantly. It left some to die by inches, forcing the survivors to watch the slow, agonizing departure of the people they loved most. Outside the fuselage, the battle was not against injury, but against thirst. Humans can survive weeks without food, but in the high altitude of the Andes, dehydration kills in days. The air is incredibly dry. Every breath exhaled strips moisture from the lungs. The boys were surrounded by water, millions of tons of it in the form of snow, but they could not drink it. Eating snow at 30 degrees below zero is dangerous. It burns the mouth and throat, causing sores that refuse to heal. More importantly, it lowers the core body temperature. To eat enough snow to stay hydrated would freeze them from the inside out. They needed liquid water. The solution came from Adolfo Fito Strauch. Fito was a quiet, inventive boy who had a knack for engineering. He found rectangular sheets of aluminum from the back of the seats. He bent the aluminum into a concave shape, creating a shallow bowl. He then took the bowl out into the sun. He placed snow on the metal. The aluminum, being a conductor, absorbed the heat of the sun rapidly. The snow began to melt, trickling down the chute of the metal into empty wine bottles they had saved. It was a slow process, drop by drop. On a cloudy day, the water makers produced nothing. On a sunny day, they could produce a few liters. It became a ritual. The boys would sit in the sun, holding the aluminum sheets like religious artifacts, praying for the drip, drip, drip of salvation. The water tasted of aluminum and dirt, but to their parched throats, it was nectar. It was the first victory of human ingenuity over the mountain. As the days turned into a week, a dangerous psychology began to take hold of the group, the optimism of the doomed. They were convinced with absolute certainty that rescue was imminent. They were a plane full of wealthy boys from prominent families. The world would not simply lose them. The Chilean Air Force, the Argentine Air Force, the Uruguayan Air Force, they would all be looking. Their fathers would be hiring private planes. Every time. The wind whistled through the rocks. Heads would snap up, thinking it was a jet engine. They organized signaling parties. They found a lipstick in the luggage and used it to write SOS on the roof of the fuselage, but the lipstick ran out after one letter. They tried to arrange suitcases in a cross in the snow, but the suitcases were white and black, barely visible against the blinding glare of the glacier. On the fourth day, a plane did appear. It was a twin-engine prop plane, flying high overhead. The boys erupted from the fuselage, screaming, waving blazers, crying tears of joy. "They saw us!" they shouted. "They dipped their wings! They saw us!" The euphoria was intoxicating. They hugged each other. They began to ration the chocolate and wine not for survival, but to make it last until the helicopters arrived the next morning. They were so sure. They were so young. They believed that the universe was a just place, and that suffering had a limit. They did not know that. From the air, the white fuselage of the Fairchild was invisible against the white snow of the glacier. They did not know that the plane was no bigger than a grain of rice in a sea of spilled salt. They did not know that the pilots flying overhead saw only rock and ice. The hospital continued its grim work. Liliana Methol, the only woman left alive, became a mother figure to the boys. She was uninjured, but deeply traumatized. She slept near her husband, Javier, who was suffering from severe altitude sickness. Liliana refused to lose hope. She led the group in the rosary every night. As the sun set and the temperature plummeted, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness, her voice would rise above the wind. "Hail Mary, full of grace." And 30 voices, trembling with cold and terror, would respond, "The Lord is with thee." It was a haunting sound, a chorus of ghosts praying in a tomb. It was the only thing that kept the madness at bay. But prayer could not knit bones. It could not stop the infection that was slowly turning the legs of the wounded black, and it could not stop the hunger that was beginning to claw at their stomachs. By the 8th day, the chocolate was gone. The wine was gone. They were scraping the labels off medicine bottles to eat the glue. They were ripping the leather off the seats to chew on the strips, swallowing pieces of foam padding just to feel something in their bellies. In the hospital of hell, Canessa and Zerbino watched their patients fading. The bodies were consuming themselves. The cheeks were hollowing out. The eyes were becoming bright and manic. The human machine was running out of fuel, and in the corner, a small transistor radio that one of the boys had found in the wreckage sat silent. It was their only link to the world that had forgotten them. They struggled to get a signal in the deep valley of the mountains, but soon they would make it work, and the voice that would come out of that speaker would be far crueler than the silence of the snow. Chapter 4. The Voice on the Radio. By the 10th day, the mountains had stripped away the last vestiges of civilization. The boys were no longer a rugby team. They were a tribe of scavengers, living in the shell of a dead machine. The hunger, which had started as a gnawing discomfort, had evolved into a physical pain, a constant cramping reminder that the human body is a furnace that requires fuel. Without it, the fire begins to consume the structure that houses it. They had eaten everything that could be chewed. They had scraped the oxidized fat from the aluminum trays used to heat the airline meals. They had peeled the leather patches off the luggage, cutting them into strips and trying to swallow them whole with handfuls of snow. They had eaten the cotton stuffing from the seats, which bloated their stomachs but provided no calories. They had even tried to eat the straw found in the bottles of wine, crushing it into a paste. But the body cannot be tricked. The boys were starving. Their cheeks were beginning to hollow, their eyes sinking deep into their sockets, giving them the haunted, skeletal look of famine victims. But amidst the hunger and the cold, there was one thing that sustained them more than food: hope. It was a stubborn, irrational hope, fueled by the certainty of their own importance. They were the children of the elite. Their fathers were men of power and influence in Montevideo. It was inconceivable to them that the world would simply stop looking. In their minds, the entire southern cone of South America was mobilized. They imagined fleets of helicopters sweeping the grid, C-130, Hercules aircraft crisscrossing the peaks, ground teams with dogs scaling the slopes. Every time the wind howled through the rocks, heads would snap up, eyes wide, waiting for the thumping rhythm of rotor blades. Their only connection to this imaginary rescue fleet was a small black speaker transistor radio. It had been found in the luggage, a miraculous discovery in a pile of debris. But in the deep valley of the crash site, surrounded by high walls of iron-rich rock, the signal was almost non-existent. It was just a box of static, a hiss of white noise that mocked their isolation. The task of taming the radio fell to Roy Harley. Roy was an engineering student, a fact that in the desperate economy of the mountain made him the expert. In reality, he was a 20-year-old who had taken a few introductory classes on electronics. He knew the theory, but he had never built an antenna in a freezing fuselage with numb fingers. The pressure on him was immense. 30 starving boys watched his every move, their eyes filled with a terrifying expectation. If he could fix the radio, he could bring them the news of their salvation. Roy worked with a frantic, trembling intensity. He scavenged wire from the plane's electrical system. He enlisted help to string the wire out of the fuselage, creating a makeshift antenna that draped across the snow and the wreckage. He fiddled with the dial, turning it millimeter by millimeter, his ear pressed against the plastic speaker, listening for a human voice in the chaotic static of the atmosphere. For days, there was nothing, just the cosmic hiss of the universe. But then, the static broke. A voice cut through the noise, faint, warbling, drifting in and out like a ghost. It was a Chilean station. The boys crowded around, holding their breath, terrified that even the sound of their own respiration would drown out the signal. They heard music, a tango, a commercial for laundry detergent. The mundane nature of the broadcast was shocking. Down there in the world below, life was continuing. People were washing clothes. People were dancing. The sun was shining on warm pavement. It was a jarring reminder that the world had not stopped just because they had fallen out of it. Roy kept tuning. He found news broadcasts. Radio Mineria from Santiago, Radio Spectator from Montevideo, the boys, established a morning ritual. At dawn, while the air was still frozen and the sun was just touching the tips of the peaks, a small group would gather around Roy and the radio. They huddled together, forming a human windbreak, straining to hear the daily report on the Uruguayan plane mystery. For the first week, the news was encouraging. They heard reports of the massive search operation. They heard that planes from Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay were flying sorties. They heard their own names read out on the air. It was a strange, existential validation to hear a stranger confirm you exist, even as you sit on a glacier feeling like a ghost. "They are looking for us," Marcelo Perez, the captain, would say, his voice thick with relief. "It's only a matter of time. We just have to wait." Waiting became their job. They rationed their energy. They stayed in the fuselage to conserve heat. They were passive participants in their own rescue, trusting that the system would work. Then came the morning of October 23rd, the 10th day. The sun rose clear and bright, illuminating the vast amphitheater of snow. A group gathered around Roy Harley near the tail of the plane. The radio crackled to life. Roy turned the dial slowly, finding the frequency of a Chilean news station. The signal was strong that morning. The voice of the announcer was crisp, professional, and detached. He was reading the headlines. The boys leaned in, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Then, the announcer pivoted to the search for the missing Uruguayan aircraft. "The search for the Fairchild," the announcer said, his voice void of emotion, "has been suspended." The boys froze. The silence on the mountain seemed to rush in, filling the space between the words. "The authorities in Santiago," the announcer continued, "have confirmed that after 10 days of negative results, and due to the extreme weather conditions and the difficulty of the terrain, the aerial search has been called off. It will resume in January when the snow melts to look for the bodies." To look for the bodies. The words hung in the freezing air like an execution order. Roy clicked the radio off. For a moment, nobody moved. The shock was absolute. It was a physical blow, more violent than the crash itself. In the crash, they had lost their friends. In this moment, they lost their future. Then, the dam broke. Some of the boys began to weep, deep heaving sobs of total abandonment. Others screamed at the sky, cursing the pilots, cursing the mountains, cursing God. Nando Parado looked at the horizon, a cold fury rising in his chest. They had been erased. The world had done the math, calculated the odds, and decided they were already dead. They were just files to be closed. Funerals were probably being planned in Montevideo. Masses were being sung for their souls. Marcelo Perez, the captain who had held the group together with his unshakable faith in the system, collapsed. The structure of his world had crumbled. He had promised the boys that help was coming. He had told them to be patient. Now, that patience looked like a death sentence. He sat in the snow, his head in his hands, shattered by the realization that the rules of civilization did not apply here. But amidst the weeping and the despair, a different reaction was forming. Gustavo Nikolic, a 20-year-old veterinary student, stood up. He had listened to the broadcast. He had seen the devastation on the faces of his friends. He felt the same terror, the same hole opening up in his stomach. But as he looked at the weeping boys, he realized something profound. As long as they were waiting for rescue, they were victims. They were passive. They were helpless. But if the rescue was never coming, then the waiting was over. Nikolic turned and climbed back into the fuselage, where the injured and the weaker boys were lying in the dark, waiting for news. They looked up at him, their eyes wide with hope. "What did they say?" someone asked. "Is it good news?" Nikolic looked at them. He forced a smile onto his cracked, blistered lips. "Yes," he said, "I have good news." The boys sat up. "What? Did they find us?" "No," Nikolic said, his voice steady. "The good news is that they have called off the search." A confused silence fell over the cabin. "Why the hell is that good news?" cried Paez. "It means we're doomed." Nikolic shook his head. "No, it means that we are no longer waiting for them. It means that we have to get out of here on our own." It was a pivotal moment in the history of the disaster. In that sentence, the psychology of the group shifted. The umbilical cord connecting them to the civilized world had been cut. The radio, which had been their lifeline, was now just a box of plastic and wire. The voice on the radio had pronounced them dead, but they were breathing. They were thinking. They were furious. The realization settled over them like the cold. There would be no helicopters. There would be no men with dogs. There would be no hot chocolate poured from thermoses by rescuers. They were alone. Truly, utterly alone. The universe had left them to die. And in that abandonment, they found a terrifying kind of freedom. If they were to live, it would not be because a pilot in Santiago decided to fly a grid pattern. It would be because they decided to walk out. But to walk out, they needed strength. To have strength, they needed energy. And to have energy, they needed food. The hunger returned, sharper now, stripped of the anesthetic of hope. They looked at each other in the dim light of the fuselage. They looked at the snow outside. There was nothing to eat, except... The eyes of the survivors began to drift. They drifted to the snowbanks outside the plane. They drifted to the places where the bodies of their friends lay buried in the ice, preserved perfectly by the cold that was trying to kill them. The thought had been there, for days, lurking in the subconscious of the group, a dark, unspoken monster. Canessa had thought it, Parado had thought it, but it was too taboo, too horrific to articulate. It went against every law of God, every law of society, every instinct of their upbringing. But the voice on the radio had changed the laws. The society that made those laws had just declared them dead. If they were dead to the world, then the laws of the world no longer applied. The search was over. The wait was over. The hunger was all that remained. Chapter 5. The Hunger. The radio had been silenced, and with it, the illusion of rescue. The 27 survivors were no longer passengers waiting for a bus. They were castaways on an alien planet, and as the shock of the abandonment settled into a dull, throbbing ache in their chests, a more primal immediate crisis took center stage. The cold was an enemy that attacked from the outside, clawing at their skin and numbing their extremities. But the hunger was an enemy that attacked from the inside. It was a traitor living within their own bellies, a slow, corrosive acid that was dissolving them cell by cell. To understand the desperation that followed, one must understand the physiology of starvation at 12,000 feet. The human body is a biological furnace. its primary directive is to maintain a core temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. To do this, it burns calories. In a normal environment, a warm office, a classroom, a living room, the body burns roughly 2,000 calories a day just to keep the heart beating, the lungs inflating, and the brain firing. But the Andes are not a normal environment. In the thin air, the body struggles to oxygenate the blood. The heart rate accelerates to compensate. Every movement requires a Herculean effort. And the cold, the relentless, pervasive, 30 below zero cold, acts as a massive heat sink, sucking thermal energy from the body every second of every day. To stay alive in those conditions, a human being requires not 2,000 calories, but 6,000, perhaps even 8,000. The boys of the Old Christians Club had consumed their last real meal in Mendoza on Thursday. By the time the search was called off on the 10th day, they had been starving for over 200 hours. The process of starvation is methodical and terrifying. First, the body exhausts its glycogen stores, the quick energy sugars stored in the liver and muscles. This happens within the first 24 hours. Once the sugar is gone, the body switches to burning fat. The boys were athletes, rugby players in peak physical condition. They had muscle, but they did not have vast reserves of body fat. The fat they did have was incinerated by the cold in a matter of days. When the fat is gone, the body enters the final, most horrific phase of starvation, autophagy, self-eating. The body, desperate for fuel to keep the brain and heart alive, begins to consume its own protein. It attacks the muscles. It breaks down the biceps, the quadriceps, the calves. It attacks the lining of the stomach. It attacks the heart muscle itself. The survivors could feel this happening. They felt a profound, crushing lethargy. Lifting an arm felt like lifting a lead weight. Standing up caused their vision to tunnel and black out. Their bodies were shrinking inside their clothes. Pants that had been tight in Montevideo now hung loosely around their waists. Their cheeks hollowed out, revealing the skull beneath. Their eyes, wide and terrified, seemed to bulge from their sockets. The hunger was not just a sensation of emptiness. It was a physical pain, a cramping, twisting agony in the gut that never ceased. It was a constant screaming demand from the biology of survival, and there was nothing to silence it. In the first week, they had rationed the meager supplies found in the luggage: a few chocolate bars, some crackers, a tin of mussels, a few bottles of wine and whiskey. The rationing had been strict: a single square of chocolate and a capful of wine per person per day. It was a caloric joke, a placebo that did nothing to stop the metabolic collapse. When the food ran out, desperation drove them to madness. They began to scour the fuselage for anything that could be swallowed. They ripped the leather backing off the seats. They cut the leather into small strips and tried to chew it. It was chemically treated, tough as iron, and tasted of industrial tanning agents. They swallowed the strips whole, hoping their stomachs could extract some protein from the hide. It provided nothing but stomach cramps. They found straw inside the seat cushions. They mashed it into a paste with snow and ate it, choking on the dry, scratchy fibers. They found a tube of toothpaste and shared it like a delicacy, the minty chemical burning their cracked lips. They ate the paper labels off medicine bottles to consume the glue. They opened the luggage and found jars of face cream and lip balm, devouring the grease, only to suffer violent diarrhea that dehydrated them further and accelerated their decline. Everything in the plane was synthetic: plastic, aluminum, nylon, foam. There was no organic matter. There was no life. They looked out at the glacier. There were no birds. There were no insects. There were no lichens on the rocks. They were in a sterile laboratory of ice. The psychological toll of the hunger was as devastating as the physical. The boys became obsessed with food. It dominated every conversation. In the long, terrifying darkness of the nights, huddled together for warmth, they played a torture game. They would describe in excruciating detail the meals they would eat when they got home. One boy would describe a steak, the way the fat rendered on the grill, the smell of the charcoal, the taste of the chimichurri sauce. Another would describe a pasta dish from his favorite Italian restaurant in Montevideo, the texture of the sauce, the Parmesan cheese, They built elaborate imaginary banquets. They argued over the best way to cook a lamb. They made lists of the restaurants they would visit. For a fleeting moment, the visualization released dopamine, a ghost of satisfaction, but when the conversation ended, the reality rushed back in with tenfold force. The stomach cramped harder, the mouth watered for food that did not exist. The game became a form of masochism, a way to keep the mind alive while the body died. But amidst the hallucinations of banquets, a darker realization was forming in the minds of the group's leaders. Nando Parrado, looking out at the vast white emptiness, did the math. He looked at his own hands, seeing the tendons standing out against the skin. He looked at his friends, seeing them wither into skeletons. He knew, with the cold clarity of the mountain, that they were dying. The leather and the toothpaste were not food. They were delays. If they did not get protein, real, dense, high-calorie protein, they would all be dead within a week. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, the medical students, knew the biology. They knew that the lethargy they were feeling was the beginning of the end. The body was shutting down non-essential systems. Soon, they would not have the strength to stand. Then, they would not have the strength to shiver. Then, the cold would take them. There was protein on the mountain. There was meat. It was all around them. The bodies of the dead lay in the snow. Some were buried in the avalanche of debris from the crash. Others lay just outside the fuselage, preserved perfectly by the deep freeze. The cold that was killing the survivors was protecting the dead. It had halted decomposition. The flesh was as fresh as the moment the hearts had stopped beating. The thought did not arrive all at once. It began as a whisper in the subconscious, a dark shape moving in the back of the mind that was too terrifying to look at directly. It was the ultimate taboo, the most ancient law of human civilization. You do not eat your own. These were not strangers. These were their friends, their teammates, their family members. They had grown up together. They had played on the same fields. They had sat in the same classrooms. To look at the body of a friend and see meat required a psychological fracture so profound it threatened to shatter their minds. Nando Parrado was one of the first to give voice to the monster. He was sitting with Carlitos Paez, staring at the snow. Nando was driven by a singular burning obsession to get back to his father. He had lost his mother and his sister. His father was all he had left. He would not let the mountain take that reunion from him. "I will not die here," Nando whispered. "I will do whatever it takes to get back." Carlitos looked at him, seeing the intensity in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Nando looked toward the snowbanks where the bodies lay. He didn't say the words, but the gaze was enough. The idea began to spread through the group like a contagion. It was whispered in pairs. It was debated in the dark. It was a battle between the biological imperative to survive and the moral imperative to remain human. The boys were deeply Catholic. They had been raised with the belief in the sanctity of the human body. It was the temple of the Holy Spirit. To desecrate a corpse was a sin. To consume it was a monstrosity. They feared for their souls. If they did this, would they be damned? Would they ever be able to look their mothers in the eye again? Would they be monsters? But the hunger was a relentless theologian. It argued that the soul had already departed. What lay in the snow was just matter. It was meat and bone. It was no different than the beef they ate in Montevideo, except for the history attached to it. Canessa, the man of science, tried to frame it logically. "It is protein," he told the others. "It is energy. Without it we die. If we die, what was the point of their deaths? If we use their bodies to survive, we give their deaths meaning. We carry them with us." But logic holds little sway over nausea. The very thought of the act, the physical reality of cutting, of chewing, of swallowing human flesh, induced violent revulsion. The survivors retched at the thought. Their stomachs turned. Their minds recoiled in horror. Yet, the clock was ticking. The energy reserves were gone. The leather straps lay chewed and spit out on the floor. The toothpaste was empty. The cold was deepening. On the afternoon of the 10th day, after the radio had delivered its death sentence, the theoretical debate collided with the biological reality. They sat in the wreckage of the plane, 27 young men wasting away. They looked at each other, and they saw the truth in each other's eyes. They were no longer waiting for rescue. They were waiting to die, unless they crossed the line, unless they broke the covenant of civilization, unless they did the unthinkable. The hunger had stripped them of their fat. It had stripped them of their muscle. Now it was stripping them of their humanity, peeling back the layers of culture and religion to reveal the raw, animal instinct beneath. They sat in silence, the wind howling outside, the hunger screaming inside, and slowly, agonizingly, the decision began to form. It was not a decision made with courage. It was a decision made with terror. It was the decision of the cornered animal. They would eat, or they would die. The only question left was who would make the first cut. Chappie. Chapter 7. The Avalanche. By the 17th day, a fragile normalcy had settled over the fuselage. The horror of the covenant, the consumption of the dead, had begun to fade into the background of daily routine. The initial revulsion had been replaced by a grim pragmatism. They were eating. Their strength was returning. The lethargy that had threatened to kill them was receding, replaced by a renewed energy to survive. They believed, in their youthful naivety, that they had faced the worst the mountain had to offer. They had survived the crash. They had survived the freeze. They had conquered the hunger. They had crossed the moral event horizon and come out the other side. They began to make plans. They talked about expeditions to the west. They talked about how they would walk out once the weather improved. But the Andes is not a passive landscape. It is a dynamic, violent system. And while the boys slept, thinking they had solved the equation of survival, the mountain was preparing a variable they had not calculated. During the last few days of October, a storm had been raging on the peaks above the crash site. Millions of tons of fresh snow had fallen on the steep eastern face of the mountain. The wind had packed this snow into heavy, unstable slabs. As the sun came out on October the 29th, the temperature fluctuated. The layers of snow began to shift. The friction holding the white mass against the rock began to fail. Inside the fuselage, the mood on the night of October 29th was relatively calm. It was Sunday. They had prayed the rosary. They had eaten. They prepared for sleep. The sleeping arrangements had become a Tetris of bodies. To conserve warmth, they slept packed together in the center of the fuselage, a tangle of limbs and blankets. The injured were placed in the hammocks or near the walls. Liliana Methol and her husband Javier slept near the center. Marcelo Perez, the captain who had kept their spirits alive with his certainty of rescue, slept near the opening of the plane, close to the wall of suitcases they had built to keep out the wind. The night was dark and cold. The wind howled outside, a familiar lullaby that no longer kept them awake. One by one, the breathing of the survivors slowed into the rhythm of sleep. At midnight, the mountain moved. It did not start with a rumble. It started with a vibration, a low-frequency shudder that traveled through the ice and into the metal frame of the plane. Roy Harley, who was trying to sleep, felt a strange sensation, a sudden change in air pressure, like a door slamming in a sealed room. He heard a sound that was not the wind. It was a deep, rushing hiss, like 1,000 locomotives taking in a breath. He looked up. In the darkness, the wall of suitcases at the rear of the plane, the barrier that was their only protection from the elements, exploded inward. It wasn't just wind. It was a solid wall of snow, ice, and rock. An avalanche had broken loose on the ridge above. It had gathered speed, thundering down the slope, and slammed directly into the open tail of the fuselage. The violence was instantaneous and absolute. The snow did not flow, it punched. It hit the sleeping boys with the force of a freight train. In a fraction of a second, the interior of the plane was filled. The snow packed into every crevice, every gap, every pair of lungs that happened to be inhaling. There was no time to scream. There was no time to run. One moment, they were sleeping in a cold, dark room. The next, they were encased in concrete. The snow was heavy, dense, and wet. It pinned their arms to their sides. It pressed against their chests, making it impossible to expand their lungs. It filled their mouths and noses. Silence returned instantly. Under the snow, the struggle for life was terrifyingly lonely. Each boy was trapped in his own private coffin. Nando Parrado woke up unable to move, unable to breathe. The weight was crushing him. He felt the panic rising, the primal lizard-brain terror of suffocation. He thrashed, but the snow held him fast. He was buried alive, but not everyone was buried. By a stroke of blind luck, the avalanche had not filled the plane entirely to the roof in every section. A few inches of airspace remained near the curved ceiling in the front of the cabin. Roy Harley leaped up as the snow hit. He was buried to his waist, but his torso was free. He screamed into the darkness, "Avalanche! Avalanche!" He began to dig. He dug with his bare hands, tearing at the snow that was rapidly freezing into ice. Other survivors who had managed to keep their heads above the deluge joined him. Gustavo Zerbino, Fito Strauch. They worked with manic desperation. They knew that under the white surface, their friends were dying. They dug for faces. They dug for mouths. The first face they uncovered was gasping blue, eyes wide with terror. They cleared the airway, heard the intake of breath, and immediately moved to the next. It was a chaotic weeping triage. They pulled bodies out of the snow, slapping them, shaking them, screaming at them to breathe. But as they dug deeper, the reality of the disaster began to reveal itself. They found Liliana Methol, the woman who had been the mother of the group, the source of their spiritual strength. She had been sleeping next to her husband. Javier was pulled out alive. Liliana was not. She had suffocated under the weight. They dug for Marcelo Perez, the captain, the leader, the boy who had organized the teams, who had rationed the food, who had told them to have faith. They found him near the rear wall. He had not had a chance. The snow had hit him first and hardest. He was dead. The death of Marcelo Perez was a psychological nuclear bomb. Marcelo had been the pillar of their old world. He represented order, authority, and the link to their lives in Montevideo. He was the one who believed the rescue was coming. When the search was cancelled, he had collapsed. Now, the mountain had taken him. With Marcelo gone, the last vestige of the rugby team structure died. The hierarchy of the schoolyard was gone. The only hierarchy left was the hierarchy of survival. They kept digging. They found Enrique Platero, the boy who had pulled the metal tube from his own stomach days earlier, dead. They found Gustavo Nikolic, the boy who had delivered the news about the cancelled search with such grim determination, dead. In total, 8 people died that night. The population of the fuselage dropped from 27 to 19. But the horror was not over. The avalanche had completely buried the plane. The fuselage was now submerged under feet of snow. The rear entrance was blocked. The front cockpit windows were blocked. They were sealed inside a tomb. As the survivors huddled in the small pocket of air that remained near the roof, a new terror set in. The air was getting thin. The snow had sealed the fuselage so tightly that no oxygen could get in. They were using up the remaining air in the cabin. The flame of a lighter flickered and died. The oxygen levels were dropping. They began to feel dizzy, euphoric, sleepy. It was the onset of hypoxia. Nando Parrado, realizing what was happening, grabbed a metal pole, perhaps a piece of the luggage rack or a ski pole found in the baggage. He fought his way to the roof of the fuselage. He found a rivet, a seam in the metal. He began to stab upward, driving the pole through the aluminum skin and into the snow above. He hammered and twisted, his muscles burning, his lungs screaming for air. Finally, the pole broke through to the surface. He pulled it back. A shaft of cold, fresh air rushed down into the cabin. They took turns putting their mouths to the small hole, drinking the air like water. They had survived the impact. They had survived the suffocation, but they were now trapped. The fuselage was filled with snow. The space that had housed 27 people was now cramped for 19. They were lying on top of the dead bodies of their friends, which were still buried in the snow beneath them. They could not move them. There was nowhere to put them. For the next 3 days, a blizzard raged outside. They could not leave the plane. They were forced to live in a crawl space between the roof and the snow, lying in the wet, freezing darkness. It was during these 3 days of entombment that the final transformation of the group occurred. With Marcelo dead, a power vacuum opened. It was not filled by a new captain elected by votes. It was filled by a natural selection of will. Nando Parrado lay in the dark, pressed against the cold metal roof. He thought about his mother buried outside. He thought about his sister dead in his arms. He thought about his friends, dead beneath the snow he was lying on. Something in Nando broke, and something else hardened. He realized that the mountain was not just indifferent, it was actively trying to kill them. It would send storms, it would send avalanches, it would send cold. If they stayed in the fuselage, they would die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the mountain would eventually win. He realized that waiting was death. God would not save them. The Air Force would not save them. He turned to Carlitos Paez in the dark. "Carlitos," he whispered, "I am going to leave." "What?" Carlitos whispered back. "I am going to walk out of here," Nando said. "I am going to go west. I don't care how far it is. I don't care how high the mountains are. I'm going to walk until I die, or until I find my father." The avalanche had stripped away the last of their illusions. It taught them that there was no safety, not even inside the wreck. It taught them that survival was not a state of being. It was an act of war. The old world was dead. Marcelo was dead. The boy Nando Parrado had been was dead. The man who emerged from the snow 3 days later was different. He was cold. He was focused, and he was dangerous to the mountain. He was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. He was a predator looking for a way out. But first, they had to dig themselves out of their own grave. Chapter 8. The Entombed. For 3 days and 3 nights, the 19 survivors of the avalanche existed in a state of suspended animation, buried within the womb of the mountain. The fuselage, once a broken shell open to the elements, had been sealed tight by the deluge of snow. The world outside, the wind, the sun, the stars, ceased to exist. Their universe shrank to a space roughly 10 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 4 feet high. It was a claustrophobic nightmare. The snow had filled the cabin to near capacity, leaving only a small pocket of air near the curved ceiling. In this cramped crawl space, the survivors lay packed together like sardines, limb over limb, face against chest. They could not stand. They could barely sit. To move an arm was to elbow a friend in the face. To shift a leg was to kick an injury. The darkness was absolute. Without the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside, the interior of the plane was pitch black. They lost all sense of time. Day and night became meaningless concepts, marked only by the rhythm of their own breathing and the gnawing of their stomachs. But the most oppressive element was not the dark, nor the cold. It was the proximity to death. They were lying on top of the snow that filled the fuselage. Buried beneath that snow, mere inches below their bodies, were the corpses of the 8 friends who had died in the slide. They were sleeping on a grave. The psychological toll of this entombment was heavier than the physical one. In the silence of the dark, the mind begins to fracture. Some of the boys fell into deep catatonic depressions, refusing to speak or move. Others became manic, their minds racing with panic. The air grew stale and heavy, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, urine, and the lingering and metallic scent of the crash. Despite Nando's airshaft, the oxygen levels were low, keeping them in a perpetual state of lethargy. Yet, it was in this crucible of darkness that the Society of the Snow truly formed. Before the avalanche, they had been a group of individuals, a rugby team with a captain, cliques, and social standings imported from Montevideo. The avalanche wiped that slate clean. Marcelo Perez, the captain, was dead beneath them. The old hierarchy was gone. In the dark, a new order emerged, one based not on popularity or authority, but on pure function. The leadership fell naturally to those who could endure the psychological weight. The 3 cousins, Adolfo, Fito Strauch, Eduardo Strauch, and Daniel Fernandez, became the administrators of the group. They were calm, pragmatic, and possessed a quiet toughness that anchored the others. They did not give speeches. They solved problems. They organized the sleeping arrangements to ensure the youngest and weakest were in the warmest spots. They managed the morale, silencing panic with steady, low voices. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino remained the doctors, tending to the wounds that were festering in the humid, dirty air of the tomb. And Nando Parrado became the spirit. He was the engine of escape. While others focused on surviving the day, Nando focused on the impossible future. He spoke constantly of his father. He spoke of the West. He refused to let the group accept the fuselage as their final resting place. But survival in the tomb required more than organization. It required fuel. The hunger returned with a vengeance. They had been trapped for days without access to the food stored outside in the snowbanks. The energy they had gained was fading. The cold was seeping through the aluminum skin of the plane. The conversation that followed was the darkest of the entire 72 days. They were trapped. They were starving, and the only source of sustenance lay directly beneath them. The bodies of the avalanche victims, Marcelo, Liliana, Enrique, Gustavo, were fresh. They were friends who, just hours before, had been talking, praying, and sleeping beside them. To eat the bodies of the dead outside, who had died in the crash weeks ago, had been a trauma. But to eat the friends who had just died, whose bodies were still warm when the snow hit, required a dissociation so complete it shattered the last remnants of their civilized selves. They had no tools. They had no light. They had to use shards of glass in the pitch black. The sounds of that process, the visceral reality of it in the cramped, silent dark, is a horror that defined the limits of human endurance. They wept as they did it. They prayed for forgiveness. But they ate. They ate because the alternative was to lie down in the dark and join Marcelo beneath the snow. On the third day of entombment, November the 1st, the storm outside began to break. The boys sensed a change in the air, pressure coming through the vent. The howling wind quieted. Nando and the stronger boys decided it was time to break out. They began to dig upward, widening the air shaft Nando had created. It was exhausting work in the thin air, their muscles trembling with effort. They took turns hacking at the frozen snow crust. Finally, the crust gave way. A blinding beam of white light shot into the cabin. It was so intense it hurt their eyes, accustomed to 72 hours of total darkness. Roy Harley was the first to pull himself up through the tunnel. He emerged onto the surface of the glacier and gasped. The storm had left the mountain pristine, covered in a thick blanket of fresh, powder-white snow. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless azure. But when he looked down, his heart stopped. The plane was gone. The snow had completely buried the fuselage. The only sign that it existed was the small hole he had just climbed out of, and the tip of the propeller blade sticking out of the ice. Like a tombstone. They were not just trapped, they had been erased from the landscape. To any search plane flying overhead, the crash site was now just a smooth, white slope. Roy reached down and helped the others climb out. One by one, they emerged from the hole, filthy, emaciated, blinking in the sun. They looked like creatures emerging from the underworld. They were covered in grime, their beards matted, their clothes hanging off their skeletal frames. But they were alive. They stood on the buried roof of their home and breathed the cold, clean air. They looked at each other and realized how much they had changed. The boys who had crashed on October 13th were gone. The boys who stood on the glacier on November the 1st were hardened survivors. They had been buried alive and had clawed their way back to the surface. The work began immediately. They had to excavate their home. They spent hours digging tunnels, clearing the snow from the entrance, and dragging the bodies of the avalanche victims out of the fuselage. It was a grim task. They pulled Marcelo Perez out. They pulled Liliana Methol out. They laid them in the snow, weeping for the friends who had guided them through the first 2 weeks. With the fuselage cleared, life settled into a new, grotesque routine. The Society of the Snow became a fully functioning micro-civilization. The Strauss cousins took over the most difficult task, the processing of the bodies. They realized that for the group to maintain its sanity, the food had to be completely depersonified. They set up a workspace near the front of the plane, away from the eyes of the others. They worked with the efficiency of butchers, cutting the meat into strips and laying it on the roof of the plane to dry in the sun. By drying the meat, it became grey and hard, bearing no resemblance to human flesh. It became a ration, a unit of energy. The cousins forbade anyone else from participating in this task. They took the burden of the eat horror upon themselves so that the others could eat without guilt. They were the protectors of the group's mind. Inside the plane, the dynamic shifted toward preparation. They knew now that they could not stay. The Avalanche had proven that the fuselage was a death trap, but they also knew they were not strong enough to walk out yet. They needed better equipment. They needed better health. They needed a plan. They began to scavenge with renewed ingenuity. They stripped the insulation from the plane's heating ducts to make warmer blankets. They used the wool from the seat covers to make socks. They found that the plastic from the seat cushions could be melted and shaped into sunglasses to protect against snow blindness. Nando Parrado turned 23 years old during this time. He sat in the snow, looking at the peaks that imprisoned them. He did not celebrate. He simply stared at the west. "I am going," he told the group again. "As soon as the weather holds, I am going." But the weather in the Andes is a fickle jailer. Winter was slowly turning to spring, but spring, at 12,000 feet, is a relative term. The sun was getting hotter during the day, melting the surface of the snow into a slush that froze into solid ice at night. As the snow melted, the wreckage began to reveal more of its secrets. Suitcases that had been buried emerged. Pieces of the wings appeared, and with the thaw came a new discovery. They found the batteries. They were heavy industrial batteries, located in the tail section of the plane. But the tail section had been sheared off in the crash and was nowhere to be seen, or so they thought. During one of their scavenging expeditions around the crash site, beneath the fresh snow, they found something, a piece of metal that didn't belong to the main fuselage. They began to dig. They realized that the tail section, with its luggage, its insulation, and crucially, the heavy batteries that powered the plane's radio, might not be lost in the abyss. It might be further up the slope, or buried nearby. If they could find the tail, they could find the batteries. If they could find the batteries, they could power the radio, and if they could power the radio, they could tell the world they were still alive. Hope, which had been buried by the avalanche, began to sprout again. But this time, it was not a passive hope. It was an active, desperate hope. They organized an expedition. A team would go out to find the tail. It was a dangerous gamble. They would have to leave the safety of the fuselage and sleep in the open. But they had no choice. The entombed had risen. Now, they had to become explorers. Chapter 9. The Decoys. November arrived in the Andes not with warmth, but with a cruel fluctuation of temperature that turned the glacier into a torture chamber. During the day, the sun beat down with blistering intensity, turning the surface of the snow into a wet, heavy slush that soaked their clothes and boots. At night, the temperature plummeted back into the negatives, freezing the slush into a sheet of solid ice. The fuselage, buried in its snowy grave, became a humid, dripping cave. The Society of the Snow had stabilized. They had processed the horror of the avalanche. They had systematized the consumption of the dead. But stability is not survival. They were slowly rotting. The lack of vitamins was causing scurvy. Their gums were bleeding, their teeth loosening. The constant exposure to the sun and wind had turned their skin into a patchwork of burns and scabs. And despite the food source, they were burning calories faster than they could replenish them. They were dying by inches. The dream of rescue had died with the radio broadcast on day 10. But a new dream had taken its place, the dream of the radio. Since finding the fuselage of the plane buried in the snow, a theory had taken hold among the survivors, championed by the Strauch cousins and Nando Parrado. They remembered the crash. They remembered the moment the plane broke apart. The tail section, the rear of the aircraft, had been sheared off by the mountain ridge before the main fuselage slid down the glacier. In the tail were the batteries. The Fairchild FH-227D was equipped with heavy-duty batteries to power its avionics, and crucially, its high-frequency radio transmitter. The radio in the cockpit was dead because the batteries were missing, but if the tail had landed intact, the batteries might still be there. And if the batteries were there, they could bring them to the fuselage, hook them up to the radio, and call for help. It was a seductive logic. It offered a technological solution to a biological problem. It promised that they wouldn't have to walk out, a feat that terrified them as they looked at the towering peaks surrounding them. It promised that they could save themselves by turning a dial, but first they had to find the tail. On November 15th, Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin, the three strongest members of the group, set out on an expedition. Their goal was twofold: map the area and find the missing section of the plane. They walked east down the glacier. It was a brutal trek. They were malnourished, their muscles atrophied. Every step in the deep snow was a battle, but as they descended the slope, they began to find debris: a suitcase half buried, a seat cushion, a piece of twisted metal. And then, about a mile downhill from the main crash site, they saw it. It looked like a broken toy, discarded by a giant. The tail section of the Fairchild lay on its side, crumpled but largely intact. It was a treasure chest. The boys rushed to it, stumbling in the snow, fueled by adrenaline. They pried open the luggage compartments. What they found inside brought them to tears. It was not just equipment, it was civilization. They found suitcases packed for vacation. They found clean clothes, warm sweaters, socks, trousers. They found cartons of cigarettes. They found boxes of chocolates and candy that had been meant for gifts in Chile. They found comic books. For an hour, the horror of the mountain receded. They sat in the snow, smoking cigarettes, eating chocolate and reading comics. They put on fresh socks. They laughed. It was a moment of profound psychological relief, a reminder that a world of softness and pleasure still existed somewhere beyond the wall of rock. But the most important discovery was in the mechanics of the wreck. They ripped open the access panels of the tail. There, sitting heavy and silent, were the batteries. They were massive, heavy-duty aircraft batteries weighing nearly 50 pounds each. Nando and Canessa tried to lift them. They strained, their boots slipping in the ice. They realized immediately that carrying these lead blocks uphill, back to the fuselage through deep snow, was impossible. They barely had the strength to carry their own bodies. They devised a new plan. If they couldn't bring the batteries to the radio, they would bring the radio to the batteries. They returned to the main fuselage with their pockets full of chocolate and cigarettes, bringing news of the discovery. The mood in the crashed plane soared. The batteries existed. The plan was viable. They selected Roy Harley for the mission. Roy was the closest thing they had to an expert. He was the engineering student who had fiddled with the small transistor radio. He was reluctant, terrified of the responsibility, but the group pressure was immense. They looked at him as a savior. A few days later, a second expedition set out. Nando, Canessa, Vizintin, and Roy Harley. They carried the heavy radio unit from the cockpit, dragging it on a makeshift sled fashioned from a suitcase. The journey to the tail was a nightmare for Roy. He was not as strong as Nando or Canessa. He lagged behind, gasping for air, his legs burning. Nando, driven by his singular obsession with escape, urged him on, sometimes shouting, sometimes pleading. They reached the tail exhausted. For the next 3 days, they lived in the tail section. It was slightly warmer than the fuselage, protected from the wind. Roy went to work. He stripped the wires. He connected the leads to the batteries. He turned the dials. He expected the crackle of static. He expected the hum of power. He heard nothing. Roy checked the connections. He stripped the wires again. He tried different configurations. He worked until his fingers were raw and bleeding, his mind racing with panic. The others, Nando, Canessa, Vizintin, watched him with intense, desperate expectation. "Try again," they said. "Make it work, Roy." The pressure broke him. He wept over the machinery. He screamed at the radio. He knew, with the sinking dread of an engineer facing a hardware incompatibility, that it was futile. The radio in the cockpit operated on alternating current, AC, generated by the plane's engines. The batteries produced direct current, DC. Without an inverter, a complex piece of equipment destroyed in the crash, the batteries could not power the radio. They were trying to plug a toaster into a car battery. It was never going to work. The realization hit the group like a physical blow. The decoy had done its job. It had lured them into wasting precious days and priceless calories on a technological fantasy. The radio was dead. The batteries were useless heavy bricks. Nando looked at the silent machine. He looked at the weeping Roy Harley. And in that moment of failure, Nando's resolve crystallized into something harder than ice. He realized that the radio had been a crutch. As long as they believed they could call for help, they didn't have to face the terrifying reality of the climb. The radio allowed them to hope for a miracle where someone else saved them. Now, that hope was dead. "We have to walk," Nando said. The failure at the tail was devastating, but it was not a total loss. While Roy had struggled with the radio, the others had been scavenging, and they found something that would ultimately be more valuable than the radio ever could have been. Insulation. The tail section was lined with thick quilted insulation material to keep the hydraulic lines from freezing. It was waterproof, durable, and incredibly warm. Nando and Canessa ripped this insulation from the walls. They realized that the biggest obstacle to walking out of the mountains was the night. If they tried to climb the peaks, they would be exposed to temperatures of 30 or 40 degrees below zero without shelter. They would freeze to death in hours. But with this material, they could build a sleeping bag, a massive 3-man sleeping bag that could withstand the night. They gathered the insulation. They gathered more food, candy, rum, sugar. They gathered the cigarettes, and they prepared to head back to the fuselage. The return journey was bitter. Roy Harley was broken, consumed by guilt, believing he had failed the group. He could barely walk. Nando and Canessa had to practically carry him back up the hill. They arrived at the fuselage exhausted, demoralized, and bearing the news that crushed the last hope of the survivors. "The radio is dead," they told the group. The silence that followed was heavy. The boys looked at the ground. They looked at their emaciated hands. The dream of the easy way out was gone. But Nando did not let them dwell on the despair. He showed them the insulation. He showed them the sewing kit he had found in a cosmetic case. "We are going to sew," he said. "We are going to make a sleeping bag. And then, we are going to walk to Chile." The focus of the group shifted. The Strauch cousins, who had taken over the daily management of survival, organized the sewing. It became a communal task. The boys sat in the sun, taking turns stitching the thick insulation with copper wire taken from the plane's electrical system. It was difficult work. The material was tough, and their fingers were numb. But it gave them a purpose. They were no longer building a signal. They were building armor. As they sewed, Nando stood apart, staring at the great wall of rock to the west. The west had become a mythical destination for them. The co-pilot, La Guerrara, had died screaming that they had passed Curicó. The boys believed him. They believed they were on the western edge of the Andes, and that the green valleys of Chile were just on the other side of the massive peak that loomed over their crash site. They called it Mount Seler, named after Nando's father. It rose thousands of feet, almost vertically from the glacier. It was a wall of ice and rock that looked unclimbable, but Nando was possessed. He spent his days exercising, walking through the deep snow to build up his leg muscles. He ate extra rations of the meat, a privilege granted to him by the group because he was chosen as an expeditionary. He was preparing his body for violence. However, the mountain had one more cruel trick to play, one more decoy. During the expeditions to the tail, they had looked east, down the valley. The valley opened up in that direction. The walking looked easier. It sloped downward. Logic dictated that if they walked downhill, they would eventually find a river, and the river would lead to civilization. But the dying words of the pilot held them captive. "We passed Curicó. We are in Chile." If they were in Chile, then to the east lay Argentina, hundreds of miles of empty mountains. To the west, over the wall, lay freedom. They were wrong, tragically, catastrophically wrong. The crash site was actually in Argentina, deep in the interior. They had not crossed the mountains, they were in the middle of them. The wall to the west was indeed the border ridge, but beyond it lay not the green valleys of Chile, but ranges of massive peaks. To the east, downhill where the walking was, easier, lay a hotel, the Hotel Termas El Sosneado. It was abandoned for the season, but it had shelter, it had food, and it was only about 18 miles away. If they had walked east, downhill, they might have saved themselves weeks ago. They might have found the hotel, but the decoy of the pilot's words blinded them. They turned their backs on the easy path. They turned their backs on the downhill slope. Instead, they looked at the impossible wall to the west. They looked at a climb that would challenge a professional mountaineer with full gear. They looked at a death sentence, and Nando Parrado said, "I will climb it." The sewing of the sleeping bag was finished in early December. It was a masterpiece of desperation, a clumsy patchwork quilt of yellow insulation and copper wire. But it was warm. Nando, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin were chosen. They were the strongest, they were the best fed, they were the hope of the 19. On December 12th, almost 2 months, after the crash, they put on 3 pairs of pants. They put on 3 sweaters. They packed the sleeping bag. They packed socks filled with human flesh. They said goodbye to their friends. For many, it was a final goodbye. The boys remaining in the fuselage were weak, skeletal, and fading fast. If the expedition failed, they would all die. Nando looked at Carlitos Paez. "I will come back," he said. He turned to the west, toward the monster of rock and ice that blocked out the sun. He took the first step. The time for decoys was over. The time for the impossible had arrived. Chapter 10. The Impossible Climb. On the morning of December the 12th, 1972, the air at the crash site was still and bitingly cold. The sun had not yet crested the eastern peaks to touch the fuselage, leaving the wreckage in a blue frozen shadow. Outside the aluminum tomb, 3 figures stood ready. They looked less like mountaineers and more like beggars from a dystopian future. Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vizintin were layers of rags and desperation. They wore 3 pairs of trousers each. They wore multiple sweaters, the wool matted and stained. On their feet, they wore rugby boots, smooth-soled cleats designed for gripping turf, not for scaling vertical walls of glacial ice. Over their boots, they had fashioned crude gaiters from the nylon seat covers to keep out the snow. They wore hats made from the sleeves of sweaters and sunglasses, clumsily cut from the tinted plastic of the pilot's sun visors. On their backs, they carried the hope of the 16 survivors remaining in the fuselage. The sleeping bag, the heavy patchwork quilt of yellow insulation and copper wire, was strapped to Canessa's back. It was their life support system. Without it, the first night on the open mountain would kill them. In rugby socks slung over their shoulders, they carried the fuel for the journey, strips of frozen human flesh, enough for 3 days. The goodbye was brief and heavy with the unspoken. The survivors remaining at the crash site, some too weak to stand, others hobbling on improvised crutches, watched them with a mixture of reverence and terror. They knew that if these 3 men did not return, the story ended here. There were no more expeditions. There was no more food. This was the final throw of the dice. "I will come back," Nando said to Carlitos Paez. He did not say, "I will find help." He simply promised return, a vow that acknowledged the possibility of failure. They turned their backs on the fuselage, the broken metal, shell that had been their home, their hospital, and their prison for 2 months. They faced west. Looming above them, blocking out half the sky, was the mountain. To the survivors, it was simply the Mount. Later, geographers would identify it as Mount Seler, a 22,000-foot giant of rock and ice. But to the boys, it was a wall. The pilot, in his dying delirium, had insisted they were in the foothills of Chile. He claimed that just beyond this ridge lay the green valleys of Curicó. The boys believed him because they had to. The alternative, that they were stranded deep in the high Andes, was too terrifying to contemplate. They began to walk. The first few hours were deceptive. The snow at the base of the glacier was firm, and the gradient was manageable. But as the sun rose higher, the physics of the mountain began to assert themselves. The air, already thin at the crash site, grew thinner with every step. Their lungs heaved, gasping for oxygen molecules that weren't there. Their hearts hammered against their ribs like trapped birds. Nando Parrado took the lead. He was possessed by a singular demonic energy. He did not look back at the fuselage. He looked only at the snow in front of his boots. He set a punishing pace, driven by the memory of his mother and sister, and by the fear that if he stopped, he would never start again. Canessa, the more cerebral and cautious of the pair, trailed behind, calculating the calories burned with every step, his mind screaming at the illogical nature of their task. Tintin, the youngest and strongest, marched with the obedience of a soldier, carrying the heaviest load without complaint. By midday, the terrain changed. The snow gave way to hard blue ice and loose crumbling rock. The slope steepened dramatically. They were no longer walking, they were climbing. They had no climbing gear, no ropes, no pitons, no ice axes. They had only an aluminum pole taken from the plane, which Nando used as a walking stick. To ascend the steep faces of ice, they had to kick steps into the wall with the toes of their rugby boots. Kick, step, rest, kick, step, rest. It was a rhythm of agony. Their toes turned black and blue from the impact. Their leg muscles burned with lactic acid that could not be flushed away due to the lack of oxygen. As the sun began to set on the first day, they found themselves clinging to the side of the mountain, thousands of feet above the crash site. The fuselage was now just a tiny black dot in the white expanse below. The scale of their isolation hit them with vertigo-inducing force. They were ants crawling up the side of a skyscraper. They found a large rock outcrop and decided to camp. This was the first test of the sleeping bag. As the sun vanished, the temperature plummeted instantly. The wind picked up, howling around the exposed rock. They crawled into the bag, zipping it up with trembling fingers. Inside, the insulation worked. It trapped their body heat. For the first time in months, they were warm, but the warmth could not banish the fear. They were sleeping on a ledge barely wide enough for 3 men. If one of them rolled over in his sleep, they would slide into the abyss. They huddled together, listening to the wind trying to tear them off the mountain, eating the frozen meat in the dark. The next morning, the climb became a nightmare. The slope became nearly vertical. They were climbing the face of a glacier. Nando, still in the lead, drove them upward. He was reckless, fueled by adrenaline. Canessa, lagging behind, shouted at him to slow down. "Nando, you're going to kill us," Canessa yelled over the wind. "Look at the slope. One slip and we are dead." "We are already dead if we stay," Nando shouted back. "Move. Look at your feet, not the drop." The tension between them was palpable. Canessa was a man of science. He looked at the mountain and saw a probability curve that ended in 0. Nando was a man of will. He looked at the mountain and saw an enemy to be conquered. They were the perfect counterbalance, the engine and the brake. Without Nando, they would never have started. Without Canessa, they would have fallen off the cliff. By the 3rd day, the air was so thin that they could take only 3 steps before stopping to rest for a minute. They were nearing 15,000 feet. Their brains were starved of oxygen, leading to hallucinations and a dull, throbbing headache that felt like a vice. It was here that the reality of their supplies hit them. The climb was taking longer than expected. The wall was deceptive. Every time they reached a ridge, they found another, higher ridge behind it. They were burning calories at a catastrophic rate. The meat in the rugby socks was running low. They stopped on a ledge to hold a council of war. They looked at the peak above them. It was still hours, maybe a day away. They looked at their food. They did not have enough for 3 men to cross the summit and walk down the other side. Nando looked at Tintin. Tintin was strong. He had carried the heaviest pack. He had never complained, but strategy demanded a sacrifice. "Tintin," Nando said, "you have to go back." It was a brutal decision. Tintin had climbed the impossible wall with them. He had earned the right to see the other side, but if he stayed, they would all starve. If he went back, he could leave his rations with Nando and Canessa. Tintin did not argue. He understood the logic of the mountain. "Okay," he said, "I will go." He emptied his rugby sock. He gave his meat to Nando. He hugged them both, a tearful, silent farewell on the edge of the world. Then he turned around. The descent that had taken them 3 agonizing days to climb took Tintin only hours. He sat on his backside and slid. He became a human toboggan, hurtling down the ice, controlling his speed with his heels. Nando and Canessa watched him go, a small black dot shrinking until he vanished into the white. Below, now there were 2. Nando and Canessa shouldered the extra weight. They looked up at the summit. It was a towering crag of snow-capped rock, glowing red in the afternoon sun. "We sleep one more night," Nando said. "Tomorrow we reach the top. Tomorrow we see Chile." The night of December 14th was the hardest yet. They were camped just below the summit. The cold was absolute. The air was so thin they woke up gasping, terrified they had stopped breathing in their sleep. They were suspended in the death zone. On the morning of December 15th, they began the final push. The slope was almost vertical. They clawed their way up, hand over hand, digging their fingers into the ice. Nando was in a trance. Chile, green valleys, farmers, food, life. He repeated the words like a mantra. He reached the final ridge. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it would burst. He dug his boots into the snow and pulled himself up over the lip of the summit. He stood up. He looked west. He expected to see the lush, green central valley of Chile sloping down to the Pacific Ocean. He expected to see roads, towns, smoke rising from chimneys. Instead, he saw the end of the world. Stretching out before him, as far as the eye could see, was a chaotic, endless ocean of snow-capped peaks. There were no green valleys. There were no towns. There was only more mountain. Mile after mile of jagged white teeth tearing at the sky. They were not at the edge of the Andes. They were in the dead center of them. The pilot was wrong. The co-pilot was wrong. The currico they had died screaming about was a hallucination of navigation. They were nowhere. Nando collapsed to his knees. The wind howled over the summit, tearing at his clothes. The devastation was total. The hope that had fueled him for 60-odd days evaporated in a single second. The climb had been for nothing. The struggle had been for nothing. They were trapped in a fortress of ice that had no exit. Canessa scrambled. Up the ridge behind him. He stood up panting, wiping the ice from his goggles. He looked at Nando, then he looked at the view. "No," Canessa whispered. "No. My God, no." He grabbed Nando's shoulder. "We are dead, Nando. Look, it never ends. We are dead." Canessa began to unravel. The logic that had sustained him collapsed. The data was undeniable. They could not walk across infinity. They had no food, no strength, no gear. The rational decision was to sit down and wait for the cold to stop the heart. Nando stared at the horizon. He looked at the endless peaks. He saw the death Canessa was describing. It was right there, staring back at him. But then, something shifted in Nando Parado's mind. A cold, terrible clarity that went beyond hope and beyond reason. He stood up. He turned to Canessa. He grabbed his friend by the collar of his rotting sweater and pulled him close, their foreheads touching. "Roberto," Nando said, his voice cracking over the wind. "Look at me." Canessa was weeping, pointing at the horizon. "There is nothing, Nando. There is nothing." "I know," Nando said, "but I am not going back." He turned Canessa to face the west, towards the endless white hell. "We may be walking to our deaths," Nando said, shouting now to be heard over the gale, "but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me." He pointed a shaking finger at the furthest peak on the horizon. "I am going to walk until I stop breathing. You can come with me, or you can stay here and die, but I am walking." Canessa looked at the horizon. He looked at the face of his friend, which was burnt, bearded, and skeletal, but burning with a fire that defied the ice. He looked back at the crash site, invisible miles below them. He thought of his mother. He thought of his fiancée. The logic of the medical student warred with the instinct of the survivor. Logic said, stop. Instinct said, move. Canessa wiped the tears from his frozen cheeks. He took a breath of the thin air. You and I are friends, Nando, Canessa said quietly. We have been through too much. If you walk, I will walk with you. They stood on the peak of Mount Seler, two tiny specks on the roof of the Americas. To the east lay the grave of their friends. To the west lay the impossible. Nando adjusted the rugby sock on his shoulder. He took the first step down the other side. They walked into the white void. Chapter 11. The Green Valley. The descent from Mount Seler was not a climb. It was a controlled fall. Having made the decision to walk west into the unknown, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa abandoned the caution that had defined their ascent. They were two men walking toward their own execution, and in that acceptance they found a reckless, terrifying freedom. They stood at 22,000 feet. The slope on the western side of the summit was a sheer drop of ice and snow, angled at nearly 45 degrees. To climb down carefully would take days. They did not have. Nando looked at the drop, then sat on his backside. He dug his heels into the snow, leaned back, and pushed off. He became a human missile. He plummeted thousands of feet in seconds, the wind screaming in his ears, the world blurring into a streak of white and blue. It was insanity. If he hit a rock, he would be shattered. If he hit a crevasse, he would vanish. But he did not hit a rock. He glided to a halt in a soft bank of powder snow miles below the summit. He looked up to see Canessa following him, a dark speck hurtling down the face of the giant. When they regrouped at the bottom of the face, the adrenaline faded, replaced by the crushing reality of their position. They were no longer on the friendly side of the mountain. They were deep in the Chilean interior, in a labyrinth of valleys and canyons that no map depicted. The sun beat down on them with hammer blows. They were dehydrated, their lips cracked and bleeding, their skin burned black by the radiation. They began to walk. The terrain was a torture chamber for the feet. As they descended lower, the snow cover became patchy, revealing fields of loose shale and volcanic rock. Their rugby boots, the cleats worn down to nubs, slipped and twisted on the stones. Every step sent a shockwave of pain through their emaciated legs. Nando, still driven by the demonic energy of the summit, forged ahead. Canessa trailed behind, his body beginning to revolt. Roberto Canessa was the doctor, and he knew exactly what was happening to him. He was suffering from dysentery. The months of eating raw meat, drinking snow water, and living in filth were taking their toll. His stomach cramped violently. He had to stop constantly to relieve himself, passing nothing but liquid and blood. Each time he stopped, it was harder to start again. His energy reserves were gone. He was running on the fumes of his own will. Nando, wait, Canessa would gasp, leaning on his makeshift walking stick. I need a minute. Nando would stop and look back. He saw the skeletal figure of his friend, hunched over, his eyes glassy with fever. Nando felt a surge of frustration, but he swallowed it. He knew that if Canessa stopped, he died, and if Canessa died, Nando would be alone in the silence. We keep moving, Roberto, Nando said, his voice a dry rasp. Just to that rock. Then we rest. They played this game for days. Just to the rock. Just to the ridge. Just to the shadow. As the days blurred, December 16th, December 17th, the landscape began to shift. It was a subtle transformation, unnoticed at first by their snow-blinded eyes. The stark monochrome world of white and grey began to soften. The air grew heavier, thicker, richer in oxygen. Nando was the first to see it. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the ground near a stream of meltwater. Roberto, he whispered, look. Canessa stumbled up beside him. He looked down. There, growing in the shelter of a rock, was a patch of moss. It was a dull, rusty green. To anyone else, it was a weed. To the boys, it was a miracle. It was the first living thing they had seen in 65 days that wasn't human. Nando fell to his knees. He touched the moss. He ripped a piece off and ate it. It tasted of dirt and grit, but it was organic. It was life. They pushed on, the discovery fueling them with a manic hope. The valley began to widen. The snow receded to the peaks above them. They were walking on earth now, dirt, dust, gravel. And then the rush. They rounded a bend in the canyon and saw it, the green valley. It wasn't a hallucination. The canyon floor was carpeted in grass, real, tall, swaying grass. There were bushes, broom, and shrubs. There were trees, stunted, twisted algarobo trees, clinging to the riverbanks. The sensory overload was overwhelming. After 2 months of sterile, frozen silence, the world exploded with color and smell. The air smelled of thyme and sage. It smelled of wet earth. It smelled of heat. They ran, or tried to run, shambling forward on their broken legs. They threw themselves into the grass. They rolled in it, weeping, laughing, hugging the ground. They tore up handfuls of clover and shoved them into their mouths, chewing the stalks, swallowing the juice. It was the communion of the earth. They were back. They had descended from the planet of ice and returned to the planet of the living. But the valley was vast, and it was empty. They walked along the riverbank, the Rio Azufre, or Sulphur River. The water was grey and silty, roaring with the melt of the glaciers above. It was violent and impassable, a barrier that kept them pinned to one side of the canyon. They saw cows. At first, Nando thought he was losing his mind. He saw a shape in the distance, brown and hulking. He rubbed his eyes. It moved. Roberto, cows! They stumbled toward the animals. They were semi-wild cattle, grazing in the high pasture. The boys had no weapons. They could not kill a cow. But the mere presence of the animals meant that people were near. Cows do not exist in a vacuum. Someone owned them. Someone herded them. "We are close," Nando said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We are so close." But close is a relative term in the Andes. They walked for another 2 days. The cows ignored them. The river roared beside them. But there were no people. There were no houses. There were no fences. By the afternoon of the 9th day of the trek, December 19th, Canessa collapsed. He lay in the grass, his chest heaving. His face was a skull wrapped in parchment skin. The dysentery had drained him completely. His legs were swollen, his feet raw and bloody. "I can't," Canessa whispered. "I can't go on, Nando. You go. You are strong. You go." Nando looked at his friend. He looked at the sun dipping behind the mountains. He knew that splitting up was a death sentence. Nando might make it, but Canessa would die here, in the grass, alone. "I am not leaving you," Nando said. He knelt down. He took Canessa's pack, the sleeping bag, the remaining scraps of meat, and slung it over his own shoulder. He was now carrying double the weight. "Get up, Roberto," Nando commanded. "Lean on me. We walk until the sun goes down. Then we stop." Canessa groaned, tears of frustration leaking from his eyes. But he stood up. He draped his arm over Nando's shoulder. Together, they formed a 3-legged creature, stumbling along the riverbank. They walked for another hour. The sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. The temperature began to drop. They were looking for a place to sleep. Nando spotted a small clearing near the bend of the river, where the bank was flat. "There," Nando said. "We sleep there." They dropped their packs. Canessa sank to the ground, practically unconscious. Nando began to gather wood for a fire. They had learned to make fire in the last few days, using matches they had saved and the dry brush of the valley. As Nando collected twigs, he looked across the river. The river at this point was wide, perhaps 50 or 60 feet, and loud. The water crashed over boulders, creating a constant white noise. On the other side, the bank rose steeply into a hillside covered in scrub. Nando's eyes scanned the other bank, a habit born of desperation. He looked at the rocks. He looked at the bushes. He saw a horse. He froze. His brain tried to reject the image. "It's a rock," he told himself. "It's a shadow. It's a cow." The horse moved, and on the horse there was a man. Nando dropped the wood. The breath left his lungs. "Roberto!" he screamed. "Roberto, look!" Canessa, lying on the ground, didn't move. He mumbled something incoherent. Nando ran to him, grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him violently. "Roberto, wake up! There is a man! There is a man!" Canessa opened his eyes, confused. He struggled to sit up. Nando dragged him to the riverbank. He pointed a shaking finger across the roaring water. "Look!" Nando yelled. "Look! There!" Canessa squinted. His eyesight had deteriorated terribly in the last few weeks. "I don't see anything, Nando." He wept. "Don't do this to me. I don't see anything." "He is there!" Nando screamed. He turned back to the river. He waved his arms frantically. He screamed at the top of his lungs. "Hey! Hey! Help us! We are here!" The sound of the river swallowed his voice. The roar of the water was deafening. But the figure on the horse stopped. The man turned his head. He looked across the river. Nando fell to his knees. "He sees us." There were actually 3 men on horses, Nando realized. They were arrieros, Chilean cowboys, moving cattle. They wore flat-brimmed hats and ponchos. They looked at the 2 wild, ragged creatures screaming on the other bank. To the arrieros, Nando and Canessa must have looked like monsters. They were bearded, filthy, dressed in rags, jumping up and down and screaming in a language the wind distorted. One of the men on the horses shouted something back. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "What?" Nando screamed. "We are from the plain. The plain." The river drowned the words. Nando couldn't hear. The man couldn't hear. It was a nightmare of proximity. They were 50 feet from salvation, separated by a wall of water and noise. The man on the horse looked at the sky. It was getting dark. The shadows were swallowing the valley. He shouted something again. Nando strained his ears, desperate to catch a syllable. The man mimed writing on a piece of paper. Then he mimed sleeping. He put his hands together and rested his head on them. "Tomorrow," the man shouted. "Tomorrow." Then the man turned his horse and rode away. "No!" Nando screamed. "No! Don't go! Don't leave us!" He ran along the bank, stumbling over rocks, begging the man to come back. But the riders disappeared into the twilight. Nando stood alone by the river. Silence. Returned, save for the rushing water. He walked back to Canessa. Canessa was sitting up, trembling. "Did he see us?" Canessa asked. "Was he real?" Nando sat down. He felt a calmness wash over him that was deeper than the ocean. The uncertainty was gone. The impossible climb, the frozen nights, the hunger, the death. It was all over. "He saw us," Nando said quietly. He said, "Tomorrow." They built a fire that night. It was the first time in 70 days they felt safe. They ate the last of the meat, the final sacrifice of their friends. They lay on the grass, looking up at the stars, the same stars that had watched them freeze in the fuselage. But tonight, the stars looked different. They didn't look like indifference, they looked like home. Across the river, in a small shepherd's hut, a Chilean peasant named Sergio Catalan was making a decision. He had seen something strange by the river. He was tired. He wanted to sleep, but the desperation in the screams of those wild men haunted him. He decided that in the morning he would go back. He would bring paper, he would bring a pencil, and he would bring bread. Chapter 11 ended in the dark, by a fire, with 2 men sleeping on the edge of resurrection. Chapter 12. The Resurrection. Dawn broke over the Green Valley on Thursday, December the 21st, 1972. It was the 71st day since the crash. Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa woke near the embers of their small fire. They were stiff, cold, and ravaged by exhaustion, but their eyes were fixed on the far bank of the Rio Azufre. They waited. The fear that the man on the horse had been a hallucination, or that he had simply forgotten them, was a physical weight in their chests. The river roared on, an indifferent barrier of white water that separated the living from the dead. Then, around 9 a.m., movement. A man appeared on the opposite bank. It was the arriero, the Chilean cowboy, Sergio Catalan. He had returned. He dismounted his horse. He walked to the edge of the river bank. He saw the 2 bearded, emaciated figures on the other side. The noise of the river was still deafening, making speech impossible. Catalan, displaying the practical ingenuity of a man who lived his life in the mountains, pulled a piece of paper and a pencil from his pocket. He wrapped them around a stone. He wound a piece of string around the stone to secure the message. He wound his arm back and threw. The stone arched over the roaring water and landed in the soft mud on Nando's side of the river. Nando scrambled for it. His hands shook as he untied the string. He unfolded the paper. There was a pencil inside. Nando knelt in the dirt. He was holding the singular link to the outside world. He knew he had to be clear. He had to be concise. He pressed the pencil to the paper, writing the words that would become history. I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come to fetch us? Please, we cannot even walk. Where are we? He folded the paper. He walked to the river's edge and threw the stone back with the last reserves of his strength. Sergio Catalan picked it up. He read the note. His eyes widened. He looked across the river at the scarecrows standing on the bank. He nodded vigorously. He raised his hands in a gesture of reassurance. Then, Catalan did something that Nando would remember for the rest of his life. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out 2 loaves of crusty homemade bread and a piece of cheese. He threw them across the river. Nando caught the bread. He tore into it, shoving a piece into his mouth, then ran to Canessa and shoved a piece into his mouth. The taste of the bread, simple, dry, salty bread, was overwhelming. It was the taste of life. It was the Eucharist of their resurrection. Catalan signaled that he was leaving to get help. He mounted his horse and galloped away. Nando and Canessa sat by the river, chewing the bread, tears streaming down their faces into their wild beards. They had done it. They had walked out of the impossible, but the ordeal was not over. Sergio Catalan rode his horse for 10 hours to reach the nearest police outpost in Puente Negro. When he arrived, exhausted and covered in dust, the police were skeptical. The Uruguayan plane mystery was a cold case. Everyone on that plane was dead. The official search had been called off months ago, but Catalan produced the note. The police commander read the handwriting. I come from a plane. The machinery of the world, which had been silent for 71 days, suddenly roared to life. The news traveled up the chain of command, to the Chilean army, to the Air Force, to the government in Santiago, to the parents in Montevideo who had already held memorial services for their children. By the next morning, Friday, December the 22nd, the valley was transformed. The silence was broken by the thumping of heavy rotors. 3 Chilean Air Force helicopters appeared in the sky. Nando Parrado insisted on going back up. The pilots were hesitant. The weather was turning, and the altitude was dangerous for the helicopters. But Nando told them, "You will never find them without me." He climbed into the lead helicopter. He put on a headset. The machine lifted off, and for the first time in 2 months, Nando was flying. He watched the terrain pass beneath him, the river, the valley, the snow line. He saw the path that had taken him and Canessa 10 agonizing days to walk, disappear in minutes. Up at the fuselage, the 14 remaining survivors were huddled inside the wreck. They had heard the news on the radio that morning. The announcer had broken in with a special bulletin. 2 survivors had been found. The reaction in the fuselage was chaotic joy. They hugged, they screamed, they combed their hair, they packed their meager belongings, they put on their best remaining clothes. Then they heard the sound. It started as a low thrumming and grew into a roar that shook the glacier. The boys spilled out of the fuselage. They looked up. Coming over the ridge, chopping through the thin air, were 2 metallic angels. The helicopters were struggling in the turbulence. The pilots were fighting the controls. They couldn't land. The slope was too steep and the snow too deep. They had to hover, their skids touching the snow on one side only. Nando Parrado leaned out of the helicopter door. He looked down at the group of skeletons waving their arms in the snow. He saw Carlitos. He saw the Strauch cousins. He saw Roy Harley. He threw suitcases of food out the door. Then the rescue began. It was frantic. The altitude limited the lift capacity. The helicopters could only take half the survivors. The rescuers had to make a brutal choice. Who went first, and who stayed one more night in the hell that had been their home? The weakest went first. They were pulled into the cabins, weeping, grabbing the hands of the pilots, kissing the floor of the aircraft. For the ones left behind, a team of Andean rescue specialists jumped out of the helicopters to stay with them. That night, inside the fuselage, the remaining boys did not sleep in fear. They slept with men who had hot soup, blankets, and stories of the world below. For the first time, the hospital of hell was warm. By the next day, December 23rd, the fuselage was empty. The survivors were flown to hospitals in Santiago. The scenes that followed were a blur of media frenzy and medical intervention. They were dehydrated, starving, suffering from scurvy, broken bones, and altitude sickness. They weighed nothing. Nando had lost 90 pounds, but they were alive. They were reunited with fathers who wept uncontrollably, hugging the skeletal forms of their sons. However, as the joy settled, a dark cloud approached. The press. The world wanted to know, how? How did a group of college boys survive 72 days on a glacier with no food? Rumors began to swirl. Did they find a cargo of food in the plane? Did they hunt animals? The boys had made a pact on the mountain to tell the truth, but they wanted to tell it together, and they wanted to tell it with dignity. A press conference was called at Stella Maris College in Montevideo shortly after their return. The room was packed with journalists from around the world. The atmosphere was tense. One of the survivors, Alfredo Delgado, took the microphone. He spoke quietly. He spoke of the cold. He spoke of the hunger. He spoke of the communion. When Christ was at the Last Supper, Delgado said, he gave his body and blood to his apostles. On the mountain, our friends gave their bodies to us. He dropped the bombshell. He confirmed the cannibalism. The room went silent. It was a silence that hung on a knife edge. It could have turned to horror. It could have turned to condemnation. But then, something else happened. The parents of the boys who had not returned, the parents whose children had been consumed, stood up. They did not scream. They did not curse. They embraced the survivors. They understood. In that extreme place, beyond the boundaries of civilization, the old rules did not apply. The only rule was life. The story of the Andes survivors became a global sensation, but not as a horror story. It became a story of the resilience of the human spirit. It was the story of a group of young men who refused to accept the verdict of nature. They had been sentenced to death by the cold, by the avalanche, and by the starvation, and they had overturned the sentence. Years later, a permanent memorial was erected at the crash site. An iron cross stands in the rocks, marking the grave of the 29 who didn't come back. The fuselage itself was eventually swallowed by the glacier, ground to dust by the slow movement of the ice. But the silence of the Valley of Tears remains. It is a place of terrible beauty, a place where the wind whispers the names of the dead, and where once a group of boys climbed out of their own graves and walked across the sky to find the green valley. The mountains do not care if you live or die, but sometimes, if you are strong enough, and if you love each other enough, you can force them to let you go. There are very few stories in human history that test the absolute limits of what we are capable of. The miracle in the Andes is not just a story about a plane crash. It is a mirror. It asks us the question that none of us want to answer, but all of us wonder, who would you be on that mountain? Would you be the one who climbs, or would you be the one who waits? The boys of Flight 571 proved that the human will is stronger than rock and colder than ice. If you made it to the end of this deep dive, you are part of the inner circle of this channel. If you found value in this story, please consider hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. It is the single best way to support this kind of content. Leave a comment below. If you were in Nando Parado's shoes, standing at the top of that peak and seeing only more mountains, would you have kept walking? I'll see you in the next dark corner of history.